story are you telling yourself? Okay, so I was reading a storybook to my daughter last night, and it's a classic story, Goldilocks and the Three Bears, right? You know, we read a story every night, and last night's story was Goldilocks and the Three Bears. And, you know, it's an interesting story because, you know, that story can be interpreted in many different ways. And this video, I'd like to talk about the stories that we actually tell ourselves and how we in our lives can interpret events. So, for example, the story of Goldilocks, you know, one interpretation could be, you know, it's this poor girl who, you know, stumbles upon this cottage and tries this porridge, different porridge, a hot porridge, a cold porridge, and I forget the exact details, but you know the story, right? And then sleeps in those beds, and then breaks that chair, and you know all of this sort of thing. And it's this, and then at the end, you know, she's sleeping, and she gets a fright by it because the bears come back home, and she gets a fright, and she runs off. You know, poor girl, poor Goldilocks. That's one interpretation of the story. And another interpretation of the story is, here's this girl who trespasses into, she's an intruder. She actually goes into this home that doesn't belong to her. She eats this, these poor bears' porridge. She breaks their chairs. She sits on their chairs and she sleeps in their bed. And she's a trespasser. And, you know, the bears come home and they find Goldilocks, this intruder in their home. What a terrible person Goldilocks is, you know. So a story can be interpreted in many, many different ways. And this happens to us all the time. If you look at the news and you look at politics and you look at the media, you know, it's who's telling the story. Whose side of the story are you going to actually listen to? You know, they say there's always two sides of any story, right? And even in our own life, the stories that we tell ourselves are very, very important. They play a crucial role in how we feel about the events that happen in our life. And sometimes we tell ourselves very, very negative stories. It's called our narrative, our self-talk, right? You know, my life's not good enough, or I'm not good enough, and I don't have this and I don't have that, and you know, I'm miserable and I'm depressed, and you know, because of X, Y, and Z, right? They're all just stories in our head. And the powerful message that I want to give you in this video is that you can actually choose to tell yourself a different story about your life and about whatever it is that you're going through in your life. And as a result of telling yourself having a different interpretation of the events that happen to you, you feel different about it, right? So just think about this, okay? The power of thought is something that I always talk about in my coaching sessions and my training workshops, that everything begins in the mind. Everything begins with how we interpret the things that are actually happening to us. And you know, the famous story that I always tell is the story of this man who's working in a meat factory, and true story. And what his job is every day to take the meat from the lorry, from the factory, and load it into this frozen lorry. That's his job every day, taking the meat from the factory, loading it into this frozen lorry, a freezer in the lorry. And he's doing this job, you know, taking this meat from the factory and putting it in the freezer lorry, and the doors of that lorry shut behind him, and they lock, and he's trapped inside this, you know, freezing lorry, and it's dark, and he starts to bang on the door and shout, but no one hears him because it's towards the end of his shift and everybody's gone home for the day, and he's trapped and he's locked inside this fridge with this meat, and he's in the dark. And his mind starts telling him a story. His mind says to him, I'm going to freeze to death. I'm going to freeze to death. I'm locked in here. Nobody can hear me. I'm trapped inside this fridge. It's so and so degrees. It's freezing temperature. I'm going to freeze to death. And in the morning, everybody comes back to work and they open the doors of this lorry and they find this man. And he's on the floor of that lorry and he's dead. He's dead. And they examine his body, they do an autopsy and they say, well, how did he die? And the autopsy revealed that he died from the symptoms of frostbite of a person that had froze to death. But so then the next question asked, they asked the question, well, what was the temperature of the fridge in the lorry? And they find that the freezer was not even switched on. It was room temperature, right? The freezer lorry, the fridge was not switched on. So then the next question arises, what killed this man? What actually killed him? His story, the thoughts he thought, right? You know, we say there's a psychosomatic connection, a mind-body connection. Literally, he thought to himself, I'm going to freeze, I'm going to freeze, I'm going to freeze. And as a result of that thought became so powerful that it manifested as a physical symptom within his body, and he died, right? Just through thinking and telling himself a certain story about his situation. And there's plenty of examples like this. There's so many examples of how our thoughts can have physical manifestations within our body. It's the psychosomatic connection, right? And here's the thing. Think about the story that you're telling yourself in your life, right? Think about something right now in your life that is stressing you out, that is causing you anxiety, that's causing you to worry. Think about that situation. And I've got an exercise for you I want you to try. Just write that down at the top of the page. Write down what the situation is that's causing you that stress, that tension, that worry. Okay? And then maybe draw a line down the middle of that page. And on one side, just write your current thoughts about that situation. So write down what your current story is, right? How you're interpreting that event. It's stressful, it's terrible, it's this, it's that. So write it all down, get it all down. Now here's the challenge, right? See if you can actually take that event and interpret it in a different way. Is there a different way you can actually look at that situation, right? George Bernard Shaw, an Irish playwright, said, "You are the window from which you see the world. You are the window from which you see the world." So what he was saying is that you can choose to see things, how you see things, you can choose. You can interpret the event. So what I want you to try to do is the situation in your life that's stressing you out, that's causing you some grief, see if you can give it new meaning. See if you can give it a new interpretation. Is there a way of looking at it in a different way? Is there a new story you can tell yourself? And it becomes a habit. And as soon as you do, and as soon as you start to actually create that habit of actually interpreting everything that happens in your life for some good, looking at the glass half full rather than half empty, it's a very, very powerful way of going through life. And you reprogram the old stories that are in your head that are actually stressing you out and causing you so much pain and grief, and you start to look at things in a new and wholesome way. And you 100% have that ability to do so. But you've got to start by becoming aware of your current programming or your current story that you're telling yourself. And maybe this exercise is something that you can try. And I'd love to know if it's something that worked for you, right? Let me know, leave it in the comments below. Subscribe to the channel. I hope this has been of use to you. The stories that we tell ourselves. What story are you telling yourself? You can reinterpret any story. Thank you for listening.